Today, we're talking about a potential war with Iran, which is a fast-shifting situation. We're recording this episode on Wednesday afternoon, a day before the U.S. and Iran are scheduled to hold talks in Geneva. Ahead of the negotiation, Iranian officials are giving mixed messages, calling Trump's remarks about Iran big lies, but also saying they hope the two sides can come to an agreement through diplomacy. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, are meeting with Iran's top negotiator, Abbas Araghchi, along with a mediator from Oman. The backdrop of these talks, meanwhile, includes dozens of U.S. warships and military aircraft recently moved to the region and aimed at Iran, which are possibly a tool to put pressure on Iranian leaders to yield to negotiations, but also it's a bigger buildup than you would typically use for just that purpose. I'm Hannah Rosen. This is Radio Atlantic. President Trump has given many signals lately that he's prepared to go to war with Iran, but very little clarity about what the goal of that war would be.
My preference is to solve this problem through diplomacy.
His State of the Union this week was just a repeat of what he said before.
But one thing is certain, I will never allow the world's number one sponsor of terror, which they are by far, to have a nuclear weapon. Can't let that happen.
Earlier this week, there were reports that General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had raised concerns to the president about the scale and risks of the operation in Iran. Today, we talked to staff writer Tom Nichols about what military leadership might be thinking right now. But first, ready?
I'm ready.
Staff writer Nancy Youssef, who's been tracking the military buildup in the region. Nancy, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
What conversations have already happened? Like, what do we know is up for negotiation? What do we expect at the talks?
So it kind of depends on who you ask. If you talk to the Americans, they would say that they want the talks to include several sort of categories. First, the future of Iran's nuclear program. Second, the future of its ballistic missile capability. Third, the use of its proxies across the region. The Iranians would say that the talks have to focus strictly on their nuclear program, that asking them to limit their ballistic missile capability goes against their sovereignty and their ability for self-defense. So it depends on who you ask in terms of what specifically has been outlined. The overlap on that Venn diagram, though, is the future of its nuclear program. Having said that, the U.S. has called for a complete disarmament, which the Iranians have rejected, saying that that would be a threat to them and that they would maintain the program. And so even though we know that they agree that nuclear program is part of the talks, what is an acceptable outcome? We haven't heard publicly, at least, an agreement on what that would look like. If, for example, the United States agreed to the Iranians limiting their program for the next 3 to 5 years, would that be an acceptable outcome for the United States? As the administration's laid it out right now, it would not be.
Okay, so help me read between the lines here because you have experience following negotiations like this. Is this typical or is this massively wide gulf in which nobody's even agreeing on what they're talking about?
I wouldn't describe any of this as typical because we've built up such a big military force in the region and the threat of force is so imminent. And then on the specifics of the talks, usually, let's use the agreement from 2015, it's a months-long process. It's really deep into the details of their program. So Ernie Moniz, Secretary of Energy at the time, was at those talks because he's an expert on the topic. And so I think one of the reasons you're seeing this gap is that the talks, as they've been outlined so far, don't appear to be as detailed as I think would be useful to sort of close that gap in terms of working out what's an acceptable outcome.
So how do you interpret that? Like, they've given themselves, it sounds like from what you're saying, less time than they need, and there are a huge number of issues. What does that translate into for you?
Because of the lack of details, I don't think it's clear what an acceptable outcome would look like. If the point of these talks ultimately is to avoid the use of military force to remove threats as the United States sees them, then there should be some understanding of what could get us to that point. And I think the lack of clarity on that makes it hard for those of us watching to get a sense of what's the off-ramp.
I see. So it hasn't been clear, okay, if they do this, then we pull back.
That's right.
We don't know what the this is
That's
in
right.
that scenario. Okay. And what about from the Iran side? Have we seen them budge in negotiations like this in the past?
So the Iranians have always been pretty firm that they would not give up their program altogether, that that's just an unacceptable line. Having said that, we have heard from them throughout the week that they are interested in a diplomatic solution. But I think they have shown themselves to be skilled negotiators, both in the details of the agreement, but also in buying time for themselves, because for them, time is essential if their goal is to avoid U.S. military action.
Right. So it sounds like there still could be off-ramps.
I think that's the hope. I mean, the president in his State of the Union said that he wants to see diplomacy first. He said that he doesn't believe that the Iranians have sort of said the right thing, that he thinks they want a deal. We've heard from inside the Pentagon that there are concerns about some of the second and third order effects that could come from military strikes. It is a costly prospect. And frankly speaking, the United States conducted strikes last June. And while the president has said they obliterated the nuclear program, Stephen Witkoff came out and said that they could pose a threat within a week. And so we have seen from the administration themselves the limitations of these strikes in terms of achieving the outcome, which is an Iran that doesn't pose a nuclear threat. And so because of all that, you would think that there would be a hope of finding some pathway in which both sides can feel that they have come out on top, short of what could be a protracted, costly, and consequential military action.
Mm-hmm. Let's get into what you just mentioned, because Trump did the same thing. He repeated again in the State of the Union this week that the U.S. obliterated the nuclear program and also said they had to go in and make sure Iran had no nuclear weapons. So how do you make sense of that? What does that add up to?
That they didn't obliterate the nuclear program.
Okay. But does it add up to that a military action can't obliterate a nuclear program?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'll unpack that. Look, let's say the president's right and that the strikes completely eliminated those programs, those facilities, their capability, okay? That alone doesn't stop their ambition to have a nuclear program. It doesn't remove all the scientists who can rebuild it. So this is not a problem that can be solved strictly through military action, because military action can't deal with those other two factors. But also we know that it didn't happen the way that the president has described it in terms of a total elimination of the program. That while there was damage, we have seen the Iranians through satellite images rebuilding it. And so at face value of the president's statement, you can't call that an obliteration of the program. And if you believe, as the evidence would suggest, that there was damage but not an obliteration, then also military strikes in and of themselves don't work.
Right. So essentially these talks are necessary to achieve the goal. If the goal is, limited to the nuclear program, we haven't talked about other potential goals, then you need these diplomatic talks to get there.
That's right. These programs don't end through strikes alone.
Right. And do you get the sense from sources in the Pentagon that they are putting faith in these negotiations to change anything?
I get the sense from the Pentagon that they were prepared to send as many resources as possible, in part in the hopes that their presence would serve as a form of leverage, and that they are in the best position possible to defend themselves, roughly 40,000 U.S. troops in the region, in addition to the thousands now on these aircraft carriers, destroyers, and then on the fighter jets. So they first and foremost want to defend themselves, carry out whatever objective the president outlines. But I wouldn't say that they are hopeful, because that's not sort of their job in a way. Their job is sort of preparedness for multiple outcomes. I think the challenge they're having is the same one the public is having, is there hasn't been a clear articulation of what the U.S. wants to achieve. And without that clear objective, it is harder for the military to make plans, right? Objectives sort of set the agenda for their strike plans. And so until that is outlined, how long does the United States give the Iranians to reach a deal? How much patience does the president have for talks? If they fail, What are the military options? What is the U.S. hoping to achieve through those military options? That hasn't been, in my mind, clearly articulated such that you see a military planning towards that.
Right. So all we know is that right now they're preparing for every possible option.
Not every, because they don't have enough. For example, we don't have the 170,000 U.S. and allied ground troops that we did in the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, right? We don't have the capability, for example, to go in and remove the leadership of Iran or put in a regime change such that we are there and able to shape that post-outcome. They're preparing for an outcome where it's sustained strikes over targets, potentially nuclear targets, potentially ballistic missile and other defense targets, I would say, and potentially to go after leadership from the air.
I didn't know that, what you just said, that we don't have those potential troops, because it seems as if we sometimes talk like we do. Yeah. Like that every option is possible, that we could accomplish whatever we needed to in Iran.
No, it's such a great point. So right now we have 2 carriers in the region, more than 120 aircraft and drones, and roughly 40,000 ground troops. In the run-up to the 2003 invasion, we had 5 carriers, multi-fold more aircraft, and 170,000 U.S. and allied troops assigned to go in Iraq. That's the difference in scale. That doesn't mean that this is small. It's one of the largest military builds we've seen since 2003, but it is not on the same scale of 2003.
So one option, of course, is that Trump is using the buildup as a threat to force Iran's hand at the negotiating table. What do you think of that theory?
Stephen Witkoff said as much. He said in an interview with Fox earlier this week that the president was curious that the presence of U.S. military forces near their shores wasn't enough to lead to a capitulation of some kind. So they've said that. I would argue that that's a fundamental misreading of the Iranians, in that the Iranians see the threat to their program as an existential threat and are prepared to risk war to protect it, and are prepared to suffer casualties, arguably more than we are prepared to suffer casualties to dismantle it. So it was revealing to me in terms of how they're revealing the Iranians, if what Stephen Witkoff is saying is an accurate description of the president's position. The other thing I would note is if the use of force is designed to be leverage, and let's assume that I'm wrong and they're right and they've read the Iranians correctly, it is a very, very large presence for leverage. I think the accurate way to think about it is that at one point, it was potentially a form of leverage, but they're also there in place that to be ready to go should negotiations fail.
You know, a basic question, why the urgency? Why is this happening now?
That is the question, and I don't fully know the answer. There are pieces of it that we know. You'll remember at the end of December 2025, we saw remarkable protests that were happening across Iran in a bid by Iranians to change the leadership within their own country amid real economic hardship. And at that time, the president sent out social media posts saying that we were coming to help, and the Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group started moving towards the region. And then protests were put down, frankly, by the Iranians. Potentially great costs. The estimates are anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000 killed in the push to end those protests. And then we started hearing this discussion about needing to strike a deal. I don't know if it's a scenario where the president started on this path with one goal in mind, thinking that the regime was in trouble and that there was an opportunity for the U.S. with just a little bit of help could sort of tip the scales in the protesters' favor, and it's expanded to something else. That's one potential one, but there hasn't been an articulation for the urgency now.
Okay, let's say there is a strike. Is the U.S. on their own in this scenario, or do they have backing?
Well, that's a great question. So far, we haven't heard allied support. We've heard from Gulf partners in the region that they don't want U.S. military jets taking off from bases in their countries because they're worried about potential retaliatory strikes by the Iranians. We haven't seen an effort by the United States to build a coalition of nations that could help. Now, could some be doing intelligence sharing? Potentially. That might be one way. But in terms of military assets, this is not like the U.S. campaign against Yemen, where you saw a few allied partners support those strikes. So far, this is a U.S.-only operation in terms of military assets in the region.
You and other national security reporters have essentially been on war watch for the past few weeks. So what kind of signals are you going to be tracking while we all wait to see what happens next?
So there aren't many. The one practical one that comes to mind for me is if we start to see U.S. troops being evacuated or non-essential being moved out of military bases, that's the most tangible signal that I can think of potential imminent strikes. That would happen maybe hours before a strike would start. But that's the one tangible that comes to mind that I don't have to depend on public statements, that I can watch that and know that that's a real possibility that we're going to see strikes soon.
After the break, we talk with Tom Nichols about what the war watch might look like inside of the Pentagon.
Hi, I'm Van Newkirk, senior editor at The Atlantic. When I publish a story, my hope is that it's illuminating enough that you'll want to share it with others. Because I know that when I read a great article, I want to give that experience to someone else. That's the spirit behind The Atlantic's new Premium Plus subscription, which includes unlimited access for you and 3 other people. Maybe their family, maybe their friends. Whoever they are, you can now share all of our journalism with them for less than $4 a week. For a limited time, you'll also get the beautiful Atlantic scrapbook and a special tote bag. Subscribe to Premium Plus today at theatlantic.com/plus. That's PLUS.
Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Hannah. Nice to be back.
Okay, so let's say you're a general inside the Pentagon right now. What are you thinking at this moment about Iran? What calculations are you making?
I think one of the questions that they must have is, aside from all of the operational details, which the Pentagon is very good at, why are we doing this? What is the goal here? What is the objective? Because this is how they are trained to think, and rightly so. We are going to apply military force to an enemy regime. What is it exactly we want them to do? Sign an agreement? Agree to sign an agreement? Is it regime change? How many people are we willing to kill? How many people are we willing to lose? What is the end state? What is the outcome, the resolution that tells us when we're done?
And why is that an important set of questions? Are those operational questions because we know what weapons and ships we need? Why is that the main calculation? Because it seems like a political question. So why is it a military question?
It's a strategic question.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a tactical question about, how to fight, with small groups of planes or men or tanks. It's not an operational question. It's not about how to move large military assets around and achieve objectives in the theater. It's a strategic question, and that's what generals and admirals are supposed to be thinking about, and working with the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Council and the State Department and everybody else to give the president good advice and especially to get clarity from the president about what it is we're supposed to be doing. We teach military officers in war colleges, ends, ways, means. Strategy, is a dance among these things. What's really worrisome, and again, going back to that, notional general or admiral in the Pentagon, they have to be thinking, the president hasn't made this case to Congress. He hasn't made it to the people of the United States. I doubt he's made it to his own generals because he's so mercurial and changes his mind. I think it's really revealing that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it leaked out that he had concerns, that he was, trying to caution the president about this whole business. But without knowing where you're going, any road gets you there.
So here's what was confusing to me about the news about General Dan Kane, which you mentioned. the way he put it was, any operations against Iran will face challenges because the U.S. munitions stockpile has been depleted by defense of Israel and support for Ukraine. Can you analyze that for me? That's not about what you just said. That's about something very specific. How much munitions do we have?
Well, one of the ways that the senior military communicates to the senior civilian leadership is to talk about constraints. One definition of strategy is choice within constraints. Because if you think about it, if you have no constraints, you don't need a strategy, right? If you're Superman, you can do anything you want, and you don't really have to think about how you're going to do it. You just kind of use your superpowers and make it happen. But the issue of munition stocks will come into play depending on how long a war the president is considering. And once again, we don't have any clarity on that. Is this going to be 2 nights, 3 nights? Then we're not going to have, then Kane's concerns are not going to come into play in a very short-term, one-and-done kind of strike. But if we're going in there for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and we're just going to pound a country of more than 90 million people, that's going to be a problem. He also, I just want to say one other thing, Hannah, he brought up some other stuff, including things like alliances. So it wasn't just about munitions. I mean, he was kind of issuing a general concern that we are not in the best strategic condition right now.
Right. So it would be inappropriate or out of protocol for him to say, can you name a strategy, Mr. President? That's not the way generals communicate. They communicate very straightforwardly.
Absolutely not. The only thing he could say is, well, if you're asking me, and the thing that you can then let leak out, any general is going to say, I'm concerned about munition stocks. I want to make sure our alliances are in order. I want to make sure that, we have all our ducks in a row. That's normal. Putting it in these stark terms and then letting it leak, to me, that seems like a strategy on Kane's part.
Mm-hmm. So what is your sense about how much Trump would hear that message and take that position into account? How does that message get received inside the White House?
I don't know. Kane supposedly is one of the few people he respects and will listen to. But, when we say this is a person Donald Trump listens to, that verb listens is really doing a lot of work. This is not a deliberative president who takes on board news that he doesn't like. We saw it in his first term, and we're certainly seeing it now.
Okay, so from a general's perspective, you're not clear about the mission. You don't necessarily know how to plan for it. What's your guess about what Trump's main goal is in Iran, what he's trying to accomplish?
Trying to get inside the decision loop of somebody like Donald Trump is very difficult. I think what he really wants is regime change. But I think because, the way the president tends to wish cast and, ignore problems, he's hoping to do regime change on the cheap. Can it be done? Maybe. I mean, look, if Donald Trump somehow cleanly and efficiently removes one of the worst regimes in the world, I'll congratulate him. But I don't think it's going to be that easy, and I don't think he's thinking of it in those terms. And the problem for the generals is that when you're thinking about a goal like regime change, that's really not a military operation. That's where you really need good intelligence. You need the CIA. You need people on the ground. You need Iran experts. You need allies who are going to help you with intelligence. All that the military can do is kind of pull the fangs out of the regime's ability to repress people. So it can hit their military targets and ground their aircraft. I mean, that's what we did to Muammar Gaddafi. We did not depose. The United States and Europe, did not depose Muammar Gaddafi. We basically just stripped away his military ability so that he couldn't defend himself. We kind of put him on an even more even footing with the people that wanted to overthrow him.
All right, so let's play out a couple of scenarios. With the information that the Pentagon has right now, if we were to go to war, what would that look like?
Well, the first order of business for Americans playing in away games like this is to suppress all of the enemy's air defenses. It's to gain control of the skies. And so what you'll see is waves of flights coming off of those carriers and from American bases that are going to hit air defense sites, radars, basically to just blind and take out anything that could be a threat to our aircraft. What you do with that, I'm back to saying it. It depends on what you think you're there to do. If you're going after the nuclear sites, then you're going to hit those sites and any associated infrastructure you can find. And you're going to try and do that with as few casualties as possible. If, on the other hand, you've decided that you're going to go big and that you want to take down the regime, then you're going to do a whole bunch of different things. You're going to strike communications nodes. You're going to strike all things that give the government control and power and the ability to command. So you're going to hit command posts, you're going to hit communications, you're going to try and hit the leadership, you're going to try and figure out where they are and, hit their bunkers. I mean, there is a lot. It's a very different profile for that kind of operation. And you're going to price in that you may lose some of your people, but that you're also going to kill a fair number of Iranians in that kind of operation as well.
Okay, so your best guess is that what he wants, even if it doesn't end up going this way or he articulates it, is something like regime change because there's something heroic in that. What do you think his understanding is of the U.S.'s influence in the world and how it should behave?
I think the best model for how Donald Trump understands the world is a great book. There are two great books of international affairs. One is The Peloponnesian War, and the other is The Godfather. The Godfather explains everything you need to know about international affairs in the modern era. That the world is basically a violent and unruly place, which is true, and that it's ruled by families. And, there's Putin's family, and there's Don Xi Jinping, and there's, the unruly neighborhoods to the south. And I think he thinks of himself as the head of the commission, that he's the senior boss of the five families. So, this upstart in Iran, he needs to make his bones here, not only to show who's boss, but again, because I do think there's an issue of glory involved here. I mean, I know that this sounds like kind of dime store psychology, but you're talking about a man who keeps plastering his name on things in Washington, and has started a diplomatic crisis with our own allies because they didn't give him a peace prize.
Okay, so let's say this is the theory. It's sort of mafia-like, a little bit arbitrary and determined by whims. If that is true, what do you most worry about in that scenario?
I most worry about people like Trump and Putin, among others, walking into situations that they don't know how to get out of later. Trump is not a man who ever admits a mistake. He backs down while declaring victory, and, backing down sometimes is his only option. But I worry that he is so invested in his own image and his own ego and his own, again, his sense of, glory, that he will start the ball rolling on something that starts to turn into a larger conflict, and that his answer, and the only way he thinks he can get out of it, is just keep getting bigger hammers every time.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for helping us understand what's going on.
My pleasure. Thanks, Anna.
This episode of Radio Atlantic was produced by Rosie Hughes and Janae West. It was edited by Claudine Abade. Rob Smerciak engineered and provided original music. Genevieve Finn fact-checked. Claudine Abade is the executive producer of Atlantic Audio, and Andrea Valdez is our managing editor. Listeners, if you enjoy the show, you can support our work and the work of all Atlantic journalists when you subscribe to The Atlantic at theatlantic.com/listener. I'm Hannah Rosen. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Van Newkirk, senior editor at The Atlantic. When I publish a story, my hope is that it's illuminating enough that you'll want to share it with others. Because I know that when I read a great article, I want to give that experience to someone else. That's the spirit behind The Atlantic's new Premium Plus subscription, which includes unlimited access for you and 3 other people. Maybe their family. Maybe their friends. Whoever they are, You can now share all of our journalism with them for less than $4 a week. For a limited time, you'll also get the beautiful Atlantic scrapbook and a special tote bag. Subscribe to Premium Plus today at theatlantic.com/plus. That's PLUS.